Noon at Clarence House, every day for nearly 50 years. William Tallon crosses the drawing room with a glass. 2 parts Dubonnet, 1 part gin, mixed together and served cold. Not sequential, not ceremonial, but prepared to a consistent ratio that never changed across 5 decades of lunches. The Queen Mother takes it. The guests are already seated. They aren't ministers, they aren't family. The Spectator profile that documented the composition of these lunches in October 1985 named them Sir Frederick Ashton, Lord Drogheda, Sir Alec Guinness, Sir Fitzroy Maclean, Norman St John-Stevas. Arts establishment, political establishment, men who were entertaining and loyal and, in the judgment of several named sources, predominantly gay. The 6 p.m. martini would come later, so would the pink champagne at dinner. The guests rotated through what the Spectator called 3 parts retainers to 2 parts fresh blood, and when the last one left, the domestic staff cleared the table. They saw all of it, and for decades they said nothing. Not because they were legally prevented, because the household had a different mechanism for silence, and the staff of Clarence House had watched over many years what happened to people who talked. They had a word for it. They called it doing a crawfie. The story behind that phrase is the clearest documented example of the gap between the Queen Elizabeth the public believed it knew and the one her household actually served. This is the account that no authorized documentary has assembled in one place. Some of it comes from named biographies, some from diarists who admitted, decades after the fact, that they'd edited their own published records to protect her. And some of it arrived, independently and unsolicited, in the comment sections of YouTube videos, testimony that had been waiting, for a very long time, for exactly that kind of outlet. You weren't imagining it. The gap was real. She died on 30 March 2002 at Royal Lodge in Windsor Great Park at 3:15 in the afternoon, aged 101. Official cause of death was listed, with the kind of understatement the royal household had perfected over centuries as extreme old age. The public response was immense. Over 3 days between 5 and 8 April, an estimated 200,000 people queued past her coffin lying in state in Westminster Hall, a line that stretched over Lambeth Bridge and along the South Bank. 1 million more lined the funeral procession route to Windsor on 9 April. These aren't the same figure. The lying in state queue alone, 200,000 over 3 days, tells you something about the emotional investment Britain had constructed around her across 7 decades. She was described as the nation's favorite grandmother in documentary titles, tribute pieces, and obituary coverage. Channel 5 ran an episode called The Nation's Grandmother in 2021. Britain Express called her Icon of Our Century and the richest jewel in the royal family's crown. None of this was an official royal style. It was media construction, but construction built on something real. A woman who had been publicly visible, reliably and strategically, for most of the 20th century, and who understood that visibility was itself the job. The wartime image is the foundation of all of it. When Buckingham Palace was bombed during the Blitz in September 1940, she reportedly said, "I'm glad we've been bombed. Now I can look the East End in the face." That quote appears in multiple contemporaneous biographical sources. It did the work it was designed to do, establishing her as someone who shared the suffering rather than observed it from a safe distance. She and George VI visited bombed areas of the East End. They stayed in London. The palace had a crater in the grounds. What the wartime image didn't include was the drinking, or the lunch guests, or the household staff who served both and who absorbed, daily, a set of private opinions the official record would spend decades filing carefully under the heading of good royal standards. William Shawcross published the Authorized biography. Full title, Queen Elizabeth, the Queen Mother, the Official Biography, in 2009. Published by Macmillan in the UK and Knopf in the United States, running to approximately 1,100 pages. He had unprecedented access to the royal archives and personal papers. The critical reception described the work as exhaustive and reverential. The Los Angeles Times noted his portrait of an aristocratic Tory with paternalistic views on empire. The Guardian called it indulgent. What Shawcross actually confirmed, buried inside those 1,100 pages, is more striking than the diplomatic framing the reviews mostly noticed. A 2009 review in the Deseret News records that Shawcross himself describes the Clarence House staff as very loyal and long-serving, and made up mostly of gay men, some of whom pushed flamboyance to the limit. That isn't from an unauthorized biography. That is from the official record. Shawcross also includes in the authorized text the incident in which the Queen Mother walked into a reception for a Japanese prince and greeted him with, "Nip on, nip on." He records diarist Woodrow Wyatt's material, noting she told him she had some reservations about Jews. A lady-in-waiting's account that the Queen Mother said of African self-governance, "What a pity we're not still looking after them," is also in the authorized text. These incidents aren't omissions from the authorized biography. They are in it, surrounded by thousands of dinner party descriptions, charitable causes, and wartime letters, given roughly the weight of everything else across a 101-year life. That is one form of erasure. Not deletion, but dilution. 3 uncomfortable facts embedded in 1,000 pages of warm portrait don't cease to exist. They cease to register. The unauthorized counterweight is Lady Colin Campbell's 2012 book, The Untold Life of Queen Elizabeth the Queen Mother, published by Dynasty Press in the UK and St. Martin's Press in the United States. Campbell's book is primarily notorious for its genealogical speculation, claims about the Queen Mother's parentage, and the manner of her children's conception that mainstream biographers, including Hugo Vickers, dismissed as bizarre, and Michael Thornton called complete nonsense. Her sourcing relies on unnamed members of the royal family, aristocrats, and friends. Anyone who has read the book knows it for those headline claims. It isn't the primary source for the racism and class contempt incidents. Those come from Shawcross, from a named diarist, and from Wyatt's published diaries. Presenting Campbell as the anchor for those claims would be a mistake the research doesn't support. The structural point stands regardless. One authorized biography and one unauthorized one, covering the same woman, and the authorized record doing the heavier lifting on erasure. Not through lying, but through approving framing that renders the uncomfortable material unremarkable. Now, the drinking. Major Colin Burgess served as the Queen Mother's equerry from 1994 to 1996, seconded from the Irish Guards, and published his account, Behind Palace Doors, My Service as the Queen Mother's Equerry, in paperback in 2017. His description of the daily routine is precise. At noon, she had her first drink of the day, a potent mix of 2 parts of the fortified wine Dubonnet to 1 part of gin. Not gin, then Dubonnet. A single mixed cocktail, combined and served cold. Red wine followed at lunch. He notes her fondness for heavy clarets, and then at 6 p.m. came what Burgess calls the magic hour. She would ask him, "Colin, are we at the magic hour?" And he would mix her a martini, 1 or 2 of those before dinner. Then 1 or 2 glasses of pink champagne, Veuve Clicquot, with the meal itself. Margaret Rhodes, the Queen Mother's niece and former lady-in-waiting, confirmed to historians that this pattern never varied. Adrian Tinniswood, in his 2018 book Behind the Throne, A Domestic History of the Royal Household, described the consumption as steady rather than excessive. The Guardian's profile published at her death placed the first drink at approximately 11:45 a.m. The diarist Nancy Mitford is more vivid. She documented a Clarence House lunch at which the Queen Mother had 2 dry martinis before, wine during, and port after, and everyone was exhausted trying to keep up. Mitford is naming herself as a specific witness to a specific occasion. That detail has appeared in drinks reference publications and biographies, but hasn't surfaced in any of the major documentaries about the Queen Mother. A handwritten note the Queen Mother sent to William Tallon asking him to include 2 bottles of Dubonnet and gin for a picnic sold at auction in 2008 for approximately $25,000. The note is physical evidence of a standing preference, casual enough that she wrote it down. By the late 1990s, her overdraft at Coutts Bank was reported at approximately £4 million, first publicly cited in 1999 by the Sunday Express and picked up by the South China Morning Post, which noted Prince Charles was working on a plan to address it. The Guardian's 2002 profile quotes the Queen Mother at a dinner party. "Golly, I could do with £100,000, couldn't you? Had such an awful afternoon today with my bank manager scolding me about my overdraft." A related remark circulated in the same period. Coutts would have folded long ago but for Mummy's overdraft. Her civil list income was £643,000 per year by the time of her death. Her total estate is estimated at between £50 and £70 million. The overdraft was a lifestyle choice, not poverty. The lunch guests are the more complicated part of the documented record. The 1985 Spectator feature titled "The Queen Mother's Circle" remains the most detailed contemporaneous account of who actually sat at her Clarence House table. The names it gives are from the arts and political establishment: Sir Frederick Ashton, Lord Drogheda, Sir Alec Guinness, Sir Fitzroy Maclean, Norman St John-Stevas, Lord Annan, Sir Hugh Casson. The piece describes a composition of 3 parts retainers to 2 parts fresh blood, noting that as her contemporaries died, she sought younger substitutes, typically around 60, and that at the Castle of May she liked to include spirited young men in the party, often old Etonians who were good shots. Her formal household at Clarence House ran to approximately 60 domestic staff, above whom sat Private Secretary Sir Martin Gilliatt, Treasurer Sir Ralph Anstruther, and Comptroller Sir Alistair Aird. No mainstream named source uses the phrase "gay court of unmarried admirers" as a factual descriptor. What the documented record actually shows is something more specific and more verifiable. A household in which gay men were conspicuously present, welcomed, and trusted in a way that would have been remarkable by the standards of mid-20th century Britain, and a social circle in which several of her best-known friends were openly gay within their own worlds, even when that openness was institutionally invisible. William Tallon is the named anchor for all of it. Born in Birtley, County Durham, in November 1935, he joined the royal household as a junior assistant at Windsor in 1951, at 15 years old, having been writing letters requesting employment there for 5 years. He transferred to the Queen Mother's household at Clarence House in the 1950s and served until her death in 2002, a span of approximately 50 years. From 1978, his formal title was Steward and Page of the Backstairs. He was the only male staff member permitted to enter her private rooms without knocking. He bought her Christmas presents. He ran the lunch parties. He danced with her. A Channel 4 documentary broadcast in 2009 states plainly that Tallon fitted neatly into the Queen Mother's team as he was gay, like many of her below-stairs staff. His long-term partner was Reginald Wilcock, deputy steward and page of the presence at Clarence House. They had lived as a couple for decades. Wilcock predeceased the Queen Mother. Wilcock was given a funeral at the Queen's Chapel in Marlborough House. 2 men ran the Queen Mother's household and were a couple, and nobody at Clarence House pretended otherwise. Tom Quinn's 2015 biography, Backstairs Billy, published by Robson Press, describes Tallon as driven by 2 demons, a powerful sex drive, and an intense, almost pathological love for the Queen Mother, and documents a long list of former homosexual lovers, many of whom had also been in royal service. His behavior at Clarence House sometimes created security concerns. He turned down every press and media approach for 40 years, received his 50-year service medal, and died of liver failure in his Kennington flat on 23 November 2007, aged 71. His collection of royal memorabilia, letters, photographs, gifts, sold at auction in 2008 for £440,000 after his death. He never once sold the story himself. The authorized biography confirms the predominantly gay male household. Quinn's biography names and documents the central figure. The 1985 Spectator names the lunch guests. The picture these sources together assemble is a woman who actively preferred the company of men who occupied an unofficial, tolerated social margin, and who trusted those men precisely because their position gave them no platform from which to speak. Now the story that documents what happens when someone did speak. Marion Crawford entered royal service as governess to Princesses Elizabeth and Margaret in the early 1930s. She stayed for approximately 16 years, through the abdication, through the war, through Princess Elizabeth's marriage to the Duke of Edinburgh. The family called her Crawfie. On retirement, she was given Nottingham Cottage, a grace and favor house in the grounds of Kensington Palace. In 1950, she published The Little Princesses. The book appeared first in American serializations, Ladies' Home Journal and Woman's Own, and then as a volume. A 1950 Time review found only 2 mildly contentious passages in the whole text, an implication the family had reservations about Wallis Simpson, and a reference to royal monogrammed china. By any reasonable measure, the book was a warm and affectionate portrait of an ordinary family life that happened to occur inside Buckingham Palace. The Queen Mother's response was total. She said Crawford had gone off her head. The King and Queen severed all contact. Crawford was required to leave Nottingham Cottage. No member of the royal family ever spoke to her again. When Marion Crawford died in February 1988 in a nursing home in Aberdeen, the royal family sent no wreath to her funeral. On the surface reading, it's a story about loyalty, betrayal, and the price of speaking. Then, in June 2000, The Guardian's arts correspondent, Vanessa Thorpe, reported on the contents of a 50-year-old box of letters and legal papers that had surfaced, held by Crawford's solicitor. The documents showed that the Queen Mother had been secretly involved in a government plan to sell anecdotes about her daughter's childhood to an American magazine, a publicity exercise brokered with the palace by the Foreign Office, which believed it would improve Anglo-American relations. Crawford was the conduit. The arrangement stipulated she would be paid, but her name wouldn't appear. The Queen Mother had written to Crawford on 4 April 1949, in a letter that now exists in documented form. I do feel most definitely that you shouldn't write and sign articles about the children, as people in positions of confidence with us must be utterly oyster. The same letter refers to a Times journalist, Dermot Mora, engaged to write pieces based on information Crawford would supply. Mr. Mora, who I saw the other day, seemed to think that you could help him with his articles and get paid from America. This would be quite all right as long as your name didn't come into it. The Queen Mother helped initiate the publicity exercise. She required anonymous sourcing. When Crawford's name appeared instead, she imposed a punishment that lasted the rest of Crawford's life, 38 years. Crawford's close friend Nigel Astell told The Guardian, "She always hoped for a reconciliation, but it never came. Crawfie was intensely loyal and wouldn't use the letters to defend herself, even though they showed she had been acting in good faith." Hugo Vickers' 2005 biography, Elizabeth, the Queen Mother, published by Hutchinson, devotes an entire chapter, Chapter 22, titled Crawfie, to the affair, examining the publishing process and confirming the Queen Mother's complete and permanent cutting off. The royal family drove past her house near Balmoral on journeys to the estate. They didn't stop, not once, in 38 years. The phrase, "doing a Crawfie," entered royal staff parlance for servants who spoke publicly for money. It's still referenced in accounts of the Clarence House household written decades later. It named not just what had happened, but what would happen to you if you did the same thing. The racism and class contempt claims aren't, as some popular accounts suggest, primarily sourced from anonymous testimony or from Lady Colin Campbell's contested 2012 book. 3 named, credentialed witnesses put their own identities and reputations behind specific incidents. In June 2017, Sir Roy Strong, former director of the National Portrait Gallery and the Victoria and Albert Museum, author of published diaries covering the royal family from 1967 to 2003, spoke at the Hay Festival in Wales and admitted he had omitted the Queen Mother's racist comments from his published diaries because they were too awful. He described a specific lunch at Ham House, a V&A property, while the Queen was in Africa. Suddenly, in the middle of lunch, I was on the left of her, I think, and the Queen Mother leant over to me and said, "Beware the blackamoors." I thought, I can't put that down. It's too awful. But one knows she was color prejudiced. He also told the festival audience, "I am always protective of people who are close to me, who are friends. I revere the monarchy for all its faults." Strong was describing explicitly and in public his own decision to act as an editor between her private behavior and the historical record. He made that decision for 40 years. He announced it in 2017, 15 years after her death. The second named source is Woodrow Wyatt, the life peer and diarist whose published journals record the Queen Mother telling him she had some reservations about Jews, and that, "I despise this classlessness notion. It's so unreal." Wyatt's diary material is cited in the Shawcross authorized biography and in Guardian commentary reviewing it. The third source is, with some precision, the authorized biography itself. Shawcross includes the Nippon incident. He includes the Lady-in-Waiting's account of her views on African self-governance. Tanya Gold, reviewing the Shawcross biography for The Guardian in 2009, wrote that the book slipped into racism, acknowledging that the authorized text contained the material, not just unauthorized accounts. What suppressed these incidents to the extent they were suppressed wasn't a shortage of named sources. It was the general unwillingness, shared by Roy Strong, by the authorized biographer's framing, by decades of tribute writing, to attach an uncomfortable description permanently to a woman whom Britain had spent the better part of a century deciding to regard as a national grandmother. Clarence House ran on approximately 60 domestic staff serving the Queen Mother's various residences. Above them sat the formal household of secretaries, treasurers, and ladies-in-waiting, drawn from the titled aristocracy. Tom Quinn quotes the household's own self-description. "None of the home team ever sold anything to the press." That wasn't primarily a legal constraint. No formal non-disclosure agreements document themselves in the available record. What constrained them was something more durable. The example that had been made of Marion Crawford, conclusively, on a woman who had served the family for 16 years and written nothing worse than a warm portrait. You lost your grace and favor home, you lost access, you lost the people you had cared for. The family drove past your house on the way to Scotland and didn't stop. The deterrent wasn't a contract. It was a precedent, demonstrated once and then never needed again. The testimony accumulated anyway, in the only place it could go without consequence: private family conversation. A guard sibling, a waitress at one of the house parties, an elderly relative's account passed down through someone's mother. People who had worked at Clarence House, or had family members who had, told their children what they had seen. Their children told their children. When a History Channel posted a video suggesting her legacy was darker than the official portrait allowed, the comments filled with accounts that had been circulating in private for decades, describing, independently and from people with no apparent connection to each other, the same 3 details. That testimony doesn't meet the evidentiary standard that distinguishes the Strong admission, the Wyatt diaries, or the Burgess memoir. It can't be independently verified, but it is evidence of something, that the authorized record left a gap, and that the gap has always been understood by the people closest to it to exist. The appetite for the real story, as opposed to the authorized one, has never gone anywhere. Back to the drawing room at Clarence House. Noon. The same glass, the same ratio, the same guests arriving with the same frequency, the same staff clearing the table when they left. This scene repeated for nearly 50 years, from 1953 until 30 March 2002, and the people who served it understood clearly, without being formally told, that what happened in that room stayed in that room. The wave never stopped. The hat never went out of style. And for 50 years after her husband died, she was, by every public measure, exactly who Britain believed her to be. But ask the people who actually worked the room, not the ones who wrote the authorized biography, the ones who poured the Dubonnet and gin and cleared the plates, and you get a different woman. Not a monster, not a villain. Just someone who never had to be anyone else, because no one who saw the difference ever had the standing to say so out loud. Sir Roy Strong had the standing. He sat on her left at Ham House and heard what she said, and decided for 40 years not to write it down. Major Colin Burgess had the standing. He named the magic hour and the ratio and the pattern that never varied in a book published 15 years after she died. William Tallon had the standing, more than anyone. 50 years of access, 50 years of lunches and private rooms entered without knocking. He turned down every press approach. He died with his stories, and his memorabilia sold at auction, and the physical record of a private world passed into other hands because he had decided to keep it private. The 60 domestic staff of Clarence House had no standing at all. Until now, they only told their children. Now their children are telling everyone. If you want more stories where the authorized record and the actual record diverge, subscribe. There are more of them than most people know.